Good morning and welcome to the 31st meeting of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee for 2019. First of all, item 1 on the agenda, which is a decision by the committee to take items 3, 4 and 5 in private. Is the committee agreed? Thank you. We turn now to item 2 on the agenda, which is our consideration of the Consumer Scotland Bill, and we have with us today for that the Minister for Business, Fair Work and Skills, Jamie Hepburn. He is joined by Lorraine King, who is the head of the Consumer Policy Unit, Laura McGlynn, Consumer Scotland Bill Manager, and Stephen Rees from the Scottish Government Legal Director. So welcome to you, Minister, and welcome to your team this morning. I understand, Minister, you may have a brief opening statement.
Yes,
so
thank you.
Hand over to you.
Thank you, Convener. I'm very pleased to be before you today to ensure that the Consumer Scotland Bill receives the scrutiny and debate it deserves. It is a small bill, but its potential is significantly greater than its size might suggest, and it's right that we work together to ensure that potential can be realised. I want to begin by taking a moment to set out why we've spent so much time considering how the advocacy and advice powers that were devolved in 2016 can be used, and why the limits on our powers can't be the limits on our ambition. That goes beyond the need for a consumer body and is a more fundamental point about the need for a system in Scotland that works more proactively to understand and protect consumers and also recognises their enormous capacity to deliver change. The first and perhaps most obvious reason is that fairness demands that consumers be treated well. If consumers start to believe this isn't the case, the trust in other areas of civic life is also jeopardised. The second reason is that we know uncertainty about the future is going to bring ever more complex challenges for consumers, whether that be related to Brexit, to climate change, or to the opportunities and challenges brought by technological change. And the third reason is that consumers and their spending power are a fundamental part of our economy, and safeguarding their interests is the role of any responsible government. The bill is, of course, not the answer to all those challenges, but is an important step forward in helping us create something new and potentially transformative. Passing it will create a dedicated organisation that will work exclusively to champion the needs of consumers. The creation of a new public body has been driven by the people and organisations who work to protect consumers and best understand the difficulties of doing so. Consumer Scotland was the recommendation of, in 2015 of an independent working group which was made up of consumer protection experts, including representatives from Citizens Advice Scotland, Trading Standards, the Scottish Public Service Ombudsman and Which. Their conclusion was unambiguous, that we need an independent public body with technical expertise and an unashamed focus on consumer interests. Underpinning this conclusion, however, is an extensive and detailed exploration of the current system, which reflects the care that the group put into its deliberations. The group found that although individual organisations work well to represent consumers, the UK government's abolition of consumer focus had left significant gaps and a lack of strategic oversight. This in turn limited the system's overall effectiveness and weakened the consumer voice in public debate. The recommendations and analysis of that group have continued to be echoed by consumer experts in Scotland in the formal consultation responses in the day-to-day work, the development policy around the body, and of course in the evidence to provide to this committee in the past few months. This is not surprising. The abolition of consumer focus was met with disquiet even when it was first announced in 2010, including from the Trading Standards organisation. It was a move that the Scottish Government and many others opposed. Nonetheless, the UK Government pressed ahead with the abolition, and it's taken the devolution of some, albeit limited, consumer powers for us to try to rebuild what has been lost. That is, of course, not to say we simply want to recreate consumer focus. I recognise that we must respond to the system that exists now, as well as to the new challenges and opportunities consumers face. That's why we want to create a new body that takes an evidence-led approach to identifying and tackling consumer detriment. It will conduct rigorous investigations into the most serious aspects of consumer harm, so it goes beyond simply highlighting that consumers are being harmed and instead make credible, achievable recommendations for change. And working in cooperation with other organisations will be built into its foundations. The bill already includes an explicit reference to collaboration, and that approach will be an integral part of its culture and working practices. Its role will be to support other organisations helping to prioritise resources rather than adding duplication or confusion. The result will be, I believe, an organisation that strengthens the whole consumer system so that, like Consumer Scotland itself, it's able to work to reduce consumer harm, increase consumer confidence when dealing with business, and increase the extent to which consumer interests are considered by public authorities. Of course, I accept and welcome that we must continue to build on their extensive work with consumer experts, regulators and enforcement agencies to ensure that Consumer Scotland can have that kind of impact. I am fully committed to that because I believe that if we take the time to get it right, we can make a real difference, not only for consumers, but for those who already work to support them. This is also true of the consumer duty, which will apply to public authorities in Scotland. We are the first nation in the United Kingdom to develop such a duty, and we've done so in response to clear support for it demonstrated through the Consumer Scotland consultation. Together, the duty and the body will ensure that consumers are protected from unintended consequences of policy making and that their potential to drive change is recognised and encouraged. And as with the body, the duty's design and implementation will be done collaboratively. I'm all too aware of the danger that either becomes a token gesture or indeed another burden for public authorities to deal with. That's why the bill requires that the authorities to whom it potentially applies will be consulted to better shape how the duty works in practice. It can be, as I said at the start of these remarks, the bill is only a first step. I do not underestimate the challenge we have to ensure that it delivers in practice, but nor should anyone underestimate the potential gains if we are successful. I am grateful to the committee for furthering a constructive dialogue that will bring us closer to realising those gains, and I hope my appearance today will help in that process.
Thank you for that, Minister. If I might start with a few questions. First of all, you've talked about the desire to avoid duplication and confusion, and also you've criticised the abolition of consumer focus. But a lot of the witnesses we've heard from have been unclear about what Consumer Scotland will do in practice. And do you agree with them that a bit more clarity on that would be helpful?
Well, I think we've set out a fairly clear set of functions for Consumer Scotland in the bill. Its primary goal, of course, is to develop and advocate for very practical solutions to any areas of consumer detriment it may identify. It has 4 key functions to achieve that. First of all, to provide some strategic oversight of the consumer landscape to try and develop a full understanding of how markets work for consumers in Scotland, ensure resources are targeted to tackle that harm. It's designed, and I think this will be the primary area of activity it undertakes, to conduct real in-depth investigations into any areas where harm in Scotland is, as it considers, as an independent body, most acute, and then thereafter to recommend solutions as to how we go about tackling that area of harm. It's also designed to facilitate access to a consumer advice system that meets individual consumer needs, can aggregate the collective data that exists across a range of organisations to better support prevention work, and to comment on the Scottish Government's own policy where it might have a significant impact on consumers, and also to make sure that public authorities are complying with the statutory consumer duty that we have put in place. So I think what we've laid out is pretty clear, but if it is felt that there's some other way, and of course that's the purpose of coming to the committee and refining any bill, if it's felt that there's something on the face of the bill, or indeed out with the bill, that could help further refine that and make it clearer still, then of course I'm very open to that.
Well, if we take, for example, duty on public bodies, how does an individual enforce that duty? There's nothing in the bill to give them a direct right to enforce that, is there?
No, but then of course some of the powers that have been devolved to us are rather limited in that regard in terms of creating an enforcement agency. One of the things that will have a responsibility to, that is Consumer Scotland, will be to publish on a 3-yearly basis more or less a state of the nation report in terms of where consumers are in Scotland, and I think a critical aspect of that will be to...
Sort of high level, if I may say so.
Yes, that's
not,
right.
The bill is not intended to give individuals any rights in terms of the duties of public bodies.
Do you mean individuals on the ground?
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. It's not a redress function. It doesn't have that form of redress. suppose ultimately what the consumer duty is designed to do is to ensure that the public bodies that it relates to are, just as we require them to have an equalities impact assessment to consider how any policy they're taking forward might impact on the environment, also to consider the place of consumers. Now, in terms of redress function, no, it doesn't have that. I don't think we could legislate for that, but it is designed to ensure that public bodies are better thinking through the place of consumers when they design public policy. I think that's a good and sensible thing.
So it's more about public bodies and the Scottish Government, how they relate to each other as opposed to for individuals.
It's not so much how they relate to each other, it's so much how their policy might relate to the position of consumers in the Scottish economy and how their policy might impact on them. So it's really to make sure that they are cognizant of that when they're developing their own policy.
But surely there's no need for the bill then, because Scottish Government could see to it that they're aware of Scottish Government policy anyway.
No, it's not to be aware of Scottish Government policy, it's to be when they can construct their own policy or their own initiatives, that they have to be cognizant of the place of consumers in Scotland. So it's not about being aware of Scottish Government policy, it's about them considering the place of consumers as it relates to their own policy making. And I think putting a duty of that nature into statutory effect, just the same way we have in terms of equality impact assessments and a whole raft of other areas that public bodies that these duties relate to, they have to be cognizant of. I think that can drive change.
I suppose the response to that from some would be that these tend to be box-ticking exercises. They don't actually make any real difference. And especially if there's no duty or no means for individuals to enforce these duties, no right provided in a statute, then that's what they amount to at the end of the day.
Well, I'm cognizant of that as a concern. I recognise that that's been raised with you. I'm determined it isn't a box-ticking exercise. I suppose if that was the perception, then it could be argued that's the case of a whole range of other areas of duties that public bodies might have a responsibility to fulfil. I'm not convinced that's the case as it relates to those duties, nor am I convinced it will necessarily be the case here. What we have to do, and that's why I think it's important we consult with the public bodies as to who the duty may relate to make sure that it is meaningful, it is impactful, it can actually drive change, but also one that isn't overly burdensome, that bogs down a public body so that they can't get on with making the policies they want to make. So it's about trying to strike that balance. But yeah, I'm totally cognizant of the concern that exists that it could become a box-ticking exercise. I'm determined that we avoid that. And that's part of the reason I referred to the statutory responsibility that would be incumbent on Consumer Scotland to publish regularly a state of the position of consumers in Scotland, because a critical aspect of that will be considering how this duty is performing and functioning.
So perhaps just a final question from me before we move on to other members of the committee. If you're satisfied with the set out in the bill, the framework set out in the bill, will the Scottish Government or you as a minister provide additional clarity on issues that have been raised by witnesses before this committee going forward to deal with points that have been raised by way of statement or otherwise?
Of course, absolutely. I mean, I guess that's the purpose of me being here, but if there are things that the committee want to follow up on at any stage, then yes, absolutely, of course it will. I mean, I would make the point that this bill has been pulled together through extensive consultation. I think there's widespread support for the consumer duty from a range of bodies, not least. And yes, of course, we have to still think through precisely who the public bodies are that this duty may relate to. But I think local authorities are a fairly obvious example. And we've seen COSLA respond positively to the creation of the consumer duty. We've seen Aberdeen City Council and Glasgow City Council providing evidence to say they support it too. So I think there's widespread support for the aims and ambitions of this bill, but if there are any areas of further clarity required, then of course we'll respond to that at any stage.
Right, we'll come now to Jackie Bailey.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, Minister. You'll be aware that Citizens Advice Scotland has called for its role as a consumer advocate to be codified in the bill. Do you, as the Scottish Government, intend to bring forward any amendments to that effect?
I'm aware of it. Good morning, Ms Bailey, I should say first. Yes, I'm aware of that call. It's something they've discussed with me directly. Candidly, at this juncture, no, I don't intend on doing that. The statutory responsibilities that the Citizens Advice, the equivalent of Citizens Advice Scotland, Citizens Advice England and Wales, and the Consumer Council of Northern Ireland have in relation to the areas that we seek to legislate here are not long-standing. So it's not like there's a long history of citizens' advice being set out in statute in these areas. But to be honest with you, I'm not convinced of the necessity of it. I'm a huge supporter of the Citizens Advice Bureau network, Citizens Advice Scotland. I think they undertake critical work. They recently, and I spoke in the debate, I think you spoke in the debate as well, Ms Bailey, on the 80th anniversary of the Citizens Advice Bureau network in Scotland. And I suppose, given that they've been around for 80 years, providing advice, providing advocacy, without any form of statutory function, then I'm not necessarily convinced it needs to be set out in statute. I would also observe there are other organisations out there that perform a not dissimilar function, albeit perhaps serving a slightly different segment of the population and structured differently, such as Which or Advice Direct Scotland, who also perform a similar function, who we wouldn't intend to name in statute. All that said, I think it is, and I recognise the particular situation of Citizens Advice Bureau, Citizens Advice Scotland, and recognise that they require to be supported to undertake their work. And I think they still have a really important role to play through the significant gathering of intelligence and data and information, through the practical experience of their bureau interacting with a huge range of members of the public, particularly insofar as they relate to vulnerable members of the public. And there is, of course, incumbent on Citizens Advice Scotland a particular responsibility to consider the position of vulnerable consumers. So all that evidence and experience that Citizens Advice Bureau passing on to Citizens Advice Scotland is important, and it needs to be sustained. So we've been engaged in with Citizens Advice Scotland about how we will continue to support that. We've ensured that for the coming financial year, we've made a commitment to see an uplift in their grant funding so that they can continue that work. And of course, we'll continue to have that dialogue about how we maintain and continue support for them going forward in this important area.
Okay, I wonder whether I could follow up on your quite expansive response. You will be aware that Citizens Advice Scotland at least used to have statutory underpinning under the Consumer Estate Agents and Redress Act of 2007. This, of course, still applies to the Citizens Advice Network in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. I'm assuming you wouldn't want the Scottish Citizens Advice Network to enjoy a lesser status than they do elsewhere in the United Kingdom. So whilst you're not persuaded at the moment, could I ask you to go talk to Citizens Advice Scotland, which I'm sure you do on a regular basis, to reflect on because what they're seeking is reassurance through codifying their role in the bill. I think that's something that is sensible to do, and I would welcome an amendment from the Scottish Government. So I'm inviting you to go back and talk to them about that.
Well, I accept your invitation, but I can assure Ms Bailey she didn't need to invite me. I'm in regular, as she knows, I'm in regular dialogue with Citizens Advice Scotland about these matters and a range of other issues. I mean, I've laid out my position. It'd be disingenuous for me not to. But yes, to go back to the point the convener, in my response to the point the convener raised, of course we'll continue to discuss these issues, and if a good case can be made, I'll reflect on it. I genuinely don't see them being disadvantaged through the process of what we're seeking to do here, though. I think what Citizens Advice Scotland have been looking for is a clear commitment that they have a role in the landscape going forward, and I'm very clearly do. Whether or not we need to set that out in the face of primary legislation, I'm less convinced, but of course I maintain an open mind.
I'm sure you wouldn't want to see them disadvantaged relative to the Citizens Advice Network in England, Wales or Northern Ireland. However, you mentioned money, which was a great hook for me. I appreciate the financial commitment you've made to Citizens Advice Scotland. It is, of course, an uplift for 1 year only. An organisation of that size and scope requires to plan in the long term, not just in the short term. Can you appreciate that simply giving them an uplift for 1 year doesn't give them that long-term security? So what do you propose to do that would provide them with the reassurance they're seeking?
Well, I mean, this comes back to the age-old issue of how we can, when we have our own process of annual budget rounds, try and provide a longer-term budget position. It's not impossible. It is, of course, sometimes difficult. I guess what I have laid out very directly to Citizens Advice Scotland, and I lay it very clearly, very publicly here today, is that we have that commitment to continue that dialogue and to ensure that we support Citizens Advice Scotland to have that role. I mean, I would reflect, I mean, we are providing across a range of funding sources directly from the Scottish Government or through the levy funding that we have as Scottish Ministers responsibility for now, over £8 million to Citizens Advice Scotland and the Bureau network. Obviously a lot of that goes directly to the Bureau network, as I'm sure Ms Bailey and others would expect it to do, because they're the front-facing part of Citizens Advice service in Scotland. So we provide significant resource already, but of course, yeah, we'll continue that dialogue.
I suppose what I'm driving at, and I'll finish on this point, Convener, is you seem not to be wanting to codify their role in the bill, and you can't offer them assurance beyond 1 year. You can understand that that lack of certainty in the long term is something that is exercising mind. So again, I'm back to, how do you provide the reassurance that I know you want to provide in a way that actually does the trick in terms of reassuring Citizens Advice Scotland?
Well, I recognise it as exercising minds. I suppose and I can understand why it is, because the process of change can sometimes cause that for people. I don't want to exercise minds and cause concern. I would say, and I would observe, that putting any body in statute, because this ultimately comes down to, I think, a funding issue. So we could put Citizens Advice Scotland on the face of this bill, but it's not, doesn't in of itself necessarily commit to any particular pocket of funding. So that takes me back to that. I'm still open to the possibility of dialogue and potential amendment around their place on the face of legislation. Although I think there are other ways that we can set that out with directly on the face of the bill. For example, there is a very clear, and this is on the face of the bill, a very clear requirement on Consumer Scotland to collaborate with other players that already exist. Citizens Advice Scotland are a very obvious example. But in terms of the funding, I'm trying to provide as much reassurance as I can. I'm committing public to continuing to have that dialogue with them. I meet with them regularly. We've offered them reassurance for the coming financial year, and clearly we then need to discuss how we support them for the longer term, and I'm committed to doing that.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Gordon MacDonald.
Thanks very much, Convener. Just to give me a better understanding before I move on to more specific questions, can you tell me how will the Consumer Scotland provide strategic oversight to the consumer landscape in Scotland?
Well, I guess that goes back to the manner in which we want to ensure that there is that collaborative process between Consumer Scotland and the range of other bodies that exist that are already performing a function in relation to consumers in Scotland. That's on the face of the bill. they have to collaborate on in that fashion. The other way in which we envisage, and again I think there's been a particular call for this, is that Consumer Scotland oversee some version of a Scottish consumer protection partnership, which again would have all the players together in the same room, which I think would clearly bring them together and ensure that there's that strategic role. I think it is important to reassure those bodies out there. That doesn't mean that they... I think when we talk about oversight, it's about having oversight of the landscape, not a role of direction or oversight role over those bodies by Consumer Scotland. That's not what we intend at all. That would not be the spirit of collaboration. But just by bringing them close together, working close together, I think we can strengthen the position of consumers in Scotland.
Currently, enforcement powers are reserved to the UK government, and the only part of the landscape of consumer organisations that has any enforcement powers is obviously Trading Standards. How do you see this body working alongside Trading Standards services and supporting them to carry out their duties of enforcement?
Well, Trading Standards services are a very obvious example of the type of organisation that would be involved in that type of partnership approach. I think that would be very sensible and a very obvious thing to have happen. In terms of, I think your question is about how would Consumer Scotland support them. I guess it's mutually supportive, and so far as Trading Standards will gather a lot of intelligence on the ground by identifying people coming to them with particular issues that they can then provide to Consumer Scotland, who then may themselves determine this is one of the issues that they want to launch a detailed investigation into, and that will then provide a series of recommendations as to how we can better go about resolving some of those problems. And if Trading Standards officers or the overarching Trading Standards body here in Scotland, of which there are two, Scots and Trading Standards Scotland, if they determine this is something they want to look at, then they can move forward on that basis. Equally, there's the scope for information to travel in the opposite direction. So that's how I would envisage it happening.
So if Consumer Scotland carries out an investigation into a specific area, you know, given that the Scotland Act 2016 devolved to Scottish ministers the power to make a reference to the Competition and Markets Authority, how do you see that working in practice?
Well, effectively, so I think it's important at this stage, of course, because I've not mentioned that Consumer Scotland is independent of Scottish ministers and actually will primarily be accountable to Parliament. I thought that was an important aspect of the creation of Consumer Scotland. But when they pull together a report in relation on the back of any particular investigation they've undertaken, they then have to lodge a copy of that report before Parliament, so individual parliamentarians or committees of this Parliament, this being an obvious example of one such committee that would take an interest, can then look at that. But they also have to provide a copy to Scottish ministers. And in that, they could explicitly ask for us to make a referral to the CMA, or Scottish ministers could look at what's within the content of that report and determine thereafter this seems like something we'd have to take to the Competition Markets Authority. Of course, then it'd be over to them to consider thereafter.
Yeah. I understand that this power to make reference to the CMA is a power that's jointly exercised with the UK government. Now, obviously, there will be competing demands on the CMA to carry out and look at various aspects of the markets. Is that an element of veto that's in the it's in the legislation, in the sense that if there's a Scottish-only aspect, like, say, parcel delivery charges, and there is other issues south of the border that they might consider more important, is that a form of veto, the fact that it has to be jointly carried out with UK government ministers? Any recommendation?
I'm loath to call it a form of veto. It is what it is. That's the way the legislation has been drafted, Mr. MacDonald. I mean, you wouldn't be surprised to hear me say that my own perception would be I don't think it's entirely necessary that it had to be drafted that way, but it has been. I think should be mentioned, though, that actually the Scottish Government has a pretty good relationship with the Competition Markets Authority, and they are actually themselves going through the process of establishing a significant presence in Scotland, and they tell me that's specifically for the purpose of being able to be more responsive to the type of issue that might be more prevalent in Scotland than you see in other parts of the United Kingdom. The one you've just mentioned being a postal delivery charges being a very obvious example. So, yeah, I guess I would have, and of course, you know, the legislation you refer to is the Scotland Act 2016, not the Consumer Scotland bill. You know, I might have liked to have seen it drafted slightly differently. It is the way it is. We'll work with it on a practical basis. I don't foresee any significant challenges. If we do encounter them, then that's something we need to reflect on and have dialogue with our counterparts in the UK government to see if we can consider further.
Thanks very much.
Andy Whiteman.
Thanks very much, Convener. What are the general principles of this bill?
The general principles of this bill, do you mean in the strict legalistic sense?
Well, this committee is tasked at stage 1 to report to Parliament on what it considers to be whether it recommends to Parliament that it agrees the general principles of the bill. So I'm just wondering, what are the general principles of the bill?
Well, at a high level, the general principles are the establishment of Consumer Scotland and the establishment of a consumer duty that public bodies have to follow.
Okay, thanks. The Scottish Consumer Council was the last statutory body broadly concerned with this. I think it existed between 1975 and 2008. I'm just wondering if you have an example of a consumer issue that's arisen, say, in the past 10 years, that had this bill's provisions been enacted 10 years ago, would have been avoided?
Well, I think that is hard for me to speculate as to whether or not anything might have been avoided. But I think the very good example just provided by Mr. MacDonald in terms of postal delivery charges is an obvious example. It's one that, yes, of course, will impact other parts of the UK. I'm not suggesting that for a moment, but we know particularly impacts rural communities in Scotland, particularly the Highlands and Islands, sometimes in the most obscure of fashions. I recently had cause to visit at the invitation of Richard Lochhead, who's done a lot of good work in this area, his constituency, and see this in practice. In that I was at an area where delivery vans would refuse to deliver because of the postcode that people lived in, and would drive past them to a postcode area that they would deliver to, which seemed rather obscure. So that's the type of specific issue that it might be that Consumer Scotland wants to look at. Of course, I think it's very important to lay on the record that Consumer Scotland is an independent organisation. It will determine its own body of work. It will determine those areas that it thinks are particularly important to look at, but that could be one such example.
Have you got others?
None are occurring to me off the top of my head, Mr.
I mean, would they include the process of buying a house?
Potentially could.
I mean, one of the issues that the Scottish Consumer Council actually championed quite vigorously, actually, quite surprisingly, actually, was during the abolition of feudal tenure, because there was lots of consumers who weren't allowed to do bed and breakfast or whatever because of ridiculous conditions in their titles, etc.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, those are partial delivery charges, or the process of buying big investments like houses, are part of kind of classic consumer issues. We heard evidence last week from Professor Ian Black on behalf of a range of academics, saying really, and I'm sure you've read his evidence, or their evidence rather, which is very well put, saying that the bill sets out narrow and somewhat outdated views of a consumer and consumption, and goes on to say that we should have a definition that's more understanding of the whole kind of consumption life cycle. So, for example, if we look at houses, a good issue just now in Lothian is many of my constituents cannot sell their houses. They're at zero valuations because of cladding issues. And there's a whole, they're entirely innocent of that, of course, as consumers, but they had no warning of that, etc. So that's an issue that's arising 10 years after they purchase something. So are you sympathetic to what Professor Ian Black and his colleagues have set out?
I'm totally open-minded to looking at that. If that's something that you want to discuss with me further, Mr. Whiteman, in terms of, on the back of that evidence, to look at how we define consumer in the face of the bill. I mean, broadly, I think we've got it right, but although I recognise, and some of the questioning may take us to the area that there's been a call from others about the inclusion of small businesses within the scope and the definition of consumer. But if it's something that is of particular interest to Mr. Whiteman or any other member of the committee, or indeed any other member of the Scottish Parliament, then I'm of course happy to have that dialogue and consider if it's something that seems sensible for us to look at again.
It's just that, for example, often the classic definition of consumer is restricted to the transactional nature of consumption, which is someone pays some money to another party to buy something. And yet there are downstream impacts of consumption on the environment, for example. And there's also emerging peer-to-peer markets on websites like Gumtree and things, which raise all sorts of issues around the buying and selling of things in somewhat unregulated markets, given that the vendors are not subject to the same kind of laws that retailers or companies would be. So, I mean, their view is that consumption has moved on a long, long way since it emerged in the 1960s as a big public issue. We're in a very different place, and therefore we need very different definitions. But we'll reflect on their evidence, obviously.
Just to respond to that, I don't disagree with that at all, and I think what you've laid out, Mr. Whiteman, is exactly why I want to have, I mean, I think I made that point at the start, that the landscape has changed, it continues to change, and on that basis we want to have an organisation that's responsive to changes that are happening around us now, some that we can't even foresee, that we don't know will happen in the future. So I don't think we're actually on a different page in this. If there's a concern about the definition that has some practical impact, then of course I'm happy to pick up on that. But I don't actually think we're on separate pages in terms of the intent.
Okay. Just a final small point. In section 6, subsection 3 of the bill, it says that Consumer Scotland must have regard to the activities carried on by any other public bodies with the same functions as or similar functions to Consumer Scotland, etc. I mean, there's been some debate about what the functions of Consumer Scotland should be. Why would there ever be another public body with the same functions?
Well, I think this goes back to the area of that I mentioned earlier in terms of collaboration with other organisations that are in the same landscape in terms of consumer interest. So they're not likely to be identical functions, but they may have functions that relate to the position of consumers. I think that's what the specific provisions are, but I may ask Stephen to comment more specifically on the legal drafting within the text of the bill, if that's okay with you, Convener?
Yes, certainly.
I think the intention was simply to allow for the possibility that other public bodies might have be operating in a similar landscape. I mean, you could potentially, it could take you into competition areas potentially. It may be that there are bodies set up in the future in England and Wales or elsewhere with similar functions. It was really supposed to be a two-part test, that public bodies that have similar functions, and then really the part B of subsection 3 is any other person really where it might be desirable to work in collaboration with them. So it was just intended to try to catch.
My question is about the similar functions, that's covered. My function is about the same functions. Why would you ever envisage in a bill having regard to another public body with the same function? Surely there are no bodies with the same functions.
I think Stephen's point, and I'll again let him in, is that they may be Firth of Scotland.
Okay.
Yeah, it may be that England and Wales choose to follow our lead and set up a similar body to Consumer Scotland, and in that scenario it would be worthwhile and useful, I think, for Consumer Scotland to have regard to what that body is doing. And being same functions or similar functions, it's broad enough to catch all of those scenarios, was the intention.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Colin Beattie.
Minister, it's been suggested that Consumer Scotland should only have the power to commission advice rather than provide it. The Scottish Government's chosen to give Consumer Scotland wide powers in this area. How is it intended it will use them?
Well, again, I suppose that goes back to the point that Stephen just made. It's about ensuring that we have a body that's able to respond to any future developments, and I guess it would go back to the limited scope of what's been devolved. Essentially what's been devolved is advice and advocacy, so it would seem rather strange to establish Consumer Scotland and say they have no scope or role in terms of the provision of advice. That said, our intention at this moment in time is that Consumer Scotland will be very much focused on the high level assessment of issues at a strategic level, so that it can investigate them thoroughly and publish reports arising from those investigations with a series of recommendations as to how others, the Scottish Government being one such example, might go around resolving the issues that they may have identified. Of course, advice can take many forms as well, and it could also be that Consumer Scotland may feel it necessary in the back of some of the issues it's found to run an awareness campaign, for example, which I would consider the provision of advice. So that's that's why we've drafted the bill as we have.
And clearly there are other organisations that already provide advice of various kinds, and I guess there's maybe some uncertainty created by the Scottish Government commissioning a direct provision of consumer advice through Advice Direct Scotland. Do you think that does confuse things?
No, I think I can understand why people may posit that at this juncture, because Consumer Scotland isn't in place yet, so it doesn't exist. We've set out, I think, a very clear direction for its responsibilities. Then, of course, once it's established, has to find and establish its place in that landscape, working with those organisations. And a point of statute, it is obliged to do so. I've already referred to the partnership that others are actually suggesting Consumer Scotland should have a responsibility for. So that should allow all these organisations to come together to make sure that there is little or no duplication of effort, except for where it's felt sensible by those bodies themselves to have such.
And just to be clear, Consumer Scotland will have the role of ensuring that there is no duplication of the advice that's given? No,
it's. I don't think it can do that, in terms of a lot of these other organisations are independent of government, independent of, will all be independent of Consumer Scotland, so it can't be directive in that sense. But what it can do, and I think what there's a desire to see happen from all the bodies involved in this area of activity, is for them to come together to operate on a sensible basis so that such is minimised.
So Consumer Scotland will have a role of, if you like, facilitating the organisations that provide advice and trying to nudge them down the right path so that that duplication doesn't happen?
Well, yes and no. I guess I make the point again that these are independent organisations. They quite rightly are able to determine the work they want to undertake. So it's not about nudging them. but it does give an opportunity for them to come together to discuss areas of mutual interest, to understand the activity each are undertaking, and to determine how that they individually and collectively best move forward from having such dialogue on an ongoing basis.
There's two areas where there's been suggestion that Consumer Scotland should have a role. One is alternative dispute resolution, and the other is quality assurance of advice. What considerations has the Scottish Government given to these areas?
Well, in terms of the alternative dispute resolution, that's not been included in the bill for the very simple fact that it starts to stray into a reserved area. So it's not something that we could do. In terms of the quality assurance of advice, I guess that goes back to the point I've just made, that it's about ensuring that organisations come together to have that open dialogue about what they are involved in undertaking. Yes, Consumer Scotland, I guess, could self-identify that one of the issues for consumers is about the provision of advice and undertake an inquiry or investigation into that, but again, I would make the point that its role is not there to be an oversight body of other independent organisations that have also a role to play in terms of the provision of advice. That's not what we intend.
Just coming back to alternative dispute resolution, which is really quite an important area, the evidence that we've seen indicates that that ADR is generally not reserved, but that there are elements of EU rights to access that could be. So it seems to be a little bit mixed, but there still seems to be the potential for a role for Consumer Scotland in there. Is it something the Scottish Government would consider?
I mean, that's a hopefully I'm giving the impression, indication. I'm open to having a discussion about any of these aspects with any member of the committee if it's an area that they want to particularly pursue. If it's something we can do, then certainly we'll look at it. That's not to say we'll ultimately agree that it's something we think Consumer Scotland should do, but yes, of course, we're open to having that dialogue.
Jackie Bailey.
Yeah, supplementary. I just want to check with the Minister whether the power to coordinate and disseminate information and advice to consumers covers areas where there is a significant community safety issue. I'm thinking, for example, of another debate we had recently about the major recall of electrical products that present a significant risk to consumers, like Whirlpool, malfunctioning tumble dryers. Something like 500,000 are still left in people's homes across the UK. Does Consumer Scotland have sufficient power to deliver this?
Yes, it's not obviously able to issue edicts about the recall of products and so on. It won't have that function. It could identify the issue as something it may want to look in, and then it would be incumbent on the organisation, Consumer Scotland, to report in terms of its findings as to how we and others should respond.
Thank you.
Richard Lyle.
Yeah, on the back of Jackie Bailey's question, do you actually believe that companies adhere to the consumer rights to return the product within a guarantee product period and get a refund? And if not, could Consumer Scotland look at this?
Well, I think there's probably a mixed landscape in relation to the first part of that question, Mr. Lyle. I suspect some companies are, in fact we know, and I'm not going to name any, some companies are better at it than others. In terms of
but is that not where all the complaints come in? People take something back and they basically have to stand and haggle to get their money back. They didn't need to stand and haggle when they paid their money over.
No. I think a lot of that type of area would probably still fall into the responsibility of trading standards. If there was a recurrent theme and if it was something that was felt was necessary to be looked at a strategic level, then I think Consumer Scotland would be well capable of looking at it and reporting its findings thereafter. But in terms of a very specific instance of an individual finding that they've had poor experience as an individual consumer, that's not likely to be something that Consumer Scotland will sit there and seek to resolve or seek redress for them as an individual. I think there are other bodies out there that undertake that function, Trading Standards being the example I've cited in this case. Citizens Advice Bureau as well may take up a case for an individual. I'm aware of them having done that for some of my own constituents when people have been to them. Indeed, even members of the Scottish Parliament occasionally get involved in trying to resolve these things for their constituents. But I wouldn't foresee that being the specific role of Consumer Scotland on an individual one-to-one basis. But if it's something they become aware of as being widespread in a particular instance, in a particular issue, then Consumer Scotland could look at that on a more strategic basis.
That's reassuring.
Convener.
Thanks very much. Yes. Good morning, Minister. I wonder, could I ask you a couple of questions about data sharing and access to data that various organisations will have? When Consumer Scotland's established, it won't have any information. So I suppose that goes without saying. So what are the mechanisms for the organisation to obtain by agreement or by the use of its powers to gain access to information that's already in there in terms of the consumer landscape? And do you see that being able to do that simply by agreement, or does there need to be some kind of legislative permission for organisations to share information with Consumer Scotland?
Well, good morning to you as well, Mr. Coffey. You are right, of course, when Consumer Scotland starts, it will not have any data immediately. One of the things we intend is to make sure that there is we'll have to have a clear indication that Parliament is supportive of the creation of Consumer Scotland, of course. That will be put to the test at the stage 1 proceedings. But what we would intend to do is try and create a shadow body as a forerunner of the statutory body, so it could begin to look at some of these issues. There is a rich vein of information out there, and I've referred to that already in response to Jackie Bailey's question about Citizen Advice Scotland. I think this is one of the critical areas that they, and there'll be other organisations as well, Trading Standards officers, Advice Direct Scotland, local authorities in the wider sense. Clearly they've got the responsibility for hosting Trading Standards officers, but there'll be other parts of local authorities. They'll all have rich sources of information that could greatly assist the activities of Consumer Scotland. So what we need to ensure is that there's a framework by which information can be shared between those organisations, and equally, of course, so that Consumer Scotland can share information with those organisations. I don't think that necessitates us having any other form of primary or secondary legislation to facilitate it, because the legislation exists by which organisations must adhere to in terms of sharing of information. GDPR, for example, it may require some form of memorandum of understanding or agreement between the organisations. That's something we would seek to ensure that they put in place between themselves so that they could share that data. But we are cognisant of the need for this to be looked at, and that's why we've got a working group on data sharing established. It first met last month. Its activities are ongoing. All the information will be shared publicly via the Scottish Government's website, but of course if there are specific details that organisations would members of the committee would like to see, then of course we'll be happy to provide that. Some of the organisations that are on that group are Citizens Advice Scotland, Advice Direct Scotland, which some of the various ombudsman, trading standards organisations, some digital groups are involved as well. So we have a range of players around the table looking at these issues. The other area, of course, in terms of information gathering is that on a statutory basis, Consumer Scotland are able to require organisations to provide them information. So that's written into the bill as well. But in terms of information sharing, hopefully I've given you enough reassurance that we're thinking that through and we're making sure that will happen.
Do you see Consumer Scotland being some kind of central focal point for the kind of information gathering process in Scotland to be housed, or do you see? I mean, presumably they're not going to have the same sets of data as these other organisations that they work with. So I'm curious about what kind of data and information they might have, and what kind of data and information the organisations like CAS might have. And we're not going to be sharing and duplicating data sets all over the place, I wouldn't imagine. So what's the kind of relationship can you be, do you think?
No, but Consumer Scotland obviously has been set up for a specific purpose, so it can potentially aggregate the data that's been provided. It's then, you know, its fundamental role isn't to be a store or a repository of lots of data sets. Its real responsibility is to use the information it has, and of course it will also be incumbent on Consumer Scotland to make sure it has the requisite staffing that it can undertake some of this activity in terms of data gathering itself, going back to the point I made about its statutory powers. But its real role is to use that data for good effect through some of the inquiries and the investigations it will undertake. Now, clearly, through the process of doing that, it will have this information, and through the agreements it will strike with these other organisations, I would see, so long as it's compliant with legislation, I don't see any problem with it being able to share that information with those other organisations, or indeed publicly as it sees fit.
Thank you.
And Dean Lockhart.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister. Just first of all, a follow-up on the question of information gathering powers and the work of the working group. Is there a case in your mind for the information gathering powers to include more organisations such as local authorities and Citizens Advice Scotland?
I mean, there could be a case, and as I said, I'm willing to obviously discuss these things and hear these things. I think it's incumbent on us to ensure that Consumer Scotland is able to gather the information it needs. I'd probably, and clearly Citizens Advice Scotland are looking for reassurance at this stage. I'm instinctively loath to suggest that an independent charitable organisation of their nature might be, point of statute, compelled to, although there could still be an argument for it. So I'm open-minded in this regard.
Could maybe just chip in, if that's all right?
Please.
Just to add that we have included a regulation-making power in the bill to add to the categories of persons subject to the information gathering power. So there is that ability to expand on that in future if that's thought desirable.
Good. Thank you. That's helpful. Can I move on to the definition of consumer as currently set out in the draft bill? At the moment, as drafted, the definition of consumer would exclude small and micro businesses, and we've heard evidence that those micro businesses very much face the same consumer protection needs as individuals. Is it the intention of the Scottish Government to exclude micro business from the protections of the bill?
Well, not from the protections of the bill. I mean, I think it's almost certain that even as we have devised the bill as at present, that through the process of work it undertakes, it seems almost inevitable to me that much of the findings of the investigations, inquiries that Consumer Scotland undertakes, the findings will be just as relevant for small and micro businesses as they would be for what we might conventionally think as the individual consumer. I should say, though, at this stage, it wasn't particularly a conscious decision of mine not to include smaller or micro businesses. I'm mindful of the the fact that this has been raised with the committee. I'm open to considering it again. I would, in doing so, want to be conscious of two things. Would it widen the scope of what Consumer Scotland has to undertake, so much so that it makes its work difficult? That said, the counterbalance to that argument is that Consumer Scotland determines its own work, its own programme of work, albeit it has to consult on it, and Parliament has a role to play there through its scrutiny role of the activity of Consumer Scotland. And the other thorny issue might be, you know, how do we define, you know, for, you know, what's the cut-off point whereby you're a small business, you're not. So I guess those are my ponderings on the issue, Convener. I'm very happy to look at it and see if it's something we can look at stage 2.
Okay, that's very helpful, Minister. Thank you. Because you're right, the committee has heard evidence from a number of witnesses that in practice the existing agencies do help small micro businesses and especially sole traders who are acting in a business capacity but are also individuals. So we will take you up on your kind invitation to look at this again at stage 2. Thank you.
Okay.
Jackie Bailey.
Wanting to be on a roll here, I wonder if the Minister would also look kindly on evidence from stakeholders. Just say yes. No. Excellent. Convener, I no need to answer. No, I'll ask it anyway.
Know what the question is for the record.
Actually, I think I need to know, Convener. So.
We've heard from many of the witnesses about a flexible definition of vulnerability, because it's important that it relates to context rather than simply an individual characteristic. The example given is a 60-year-old person may not be vulnerable generally as a result of their age, but of the particular circumstances that they may be in. So I'm wondering if you're going to bring forward amendments, and you've said yes already, so that sounds great.
Well, again, cognizant of this issue having arisen, I suppose the way the bill is drafted is that there are specific examples, for want of a better term, of what might be felt to be constitute a vulnerable consumer, but it does say that it's not an exhaustive list. But yeah, I'm happy to follow that up and explore that further.
Thank you, Convener.
I think the thanks go to the Minister. Richard Lyle.
Yes, good morning, Minister. It's not clear from the bill or the policy memorandum which bodies will be covered by the consumer duty. Can you give us any further information about the Scottish Government's plans in this area?
Well, I think, again, the first thing we should see, we shouldn't underestimate the power of the... Obviously, we had a bit of dialogue with the convener about this at the start. I think we should underestimate the potential power of the consumer duty to really... You know, we'll be the first country in the UK to do this. And again, there's been a clear call from stakeholders that we should do it. So I don't think we should underestimate the power for it to influence change in the thinking of public bodies in terms of ensuring that the position of consumers, albeit there's now some dialogue between us about what we might define consumers as being, which I'm happy for us to follow up on, but ensuring that public bodies that the duty may relate to, ensuring that they are giving requisite thought to the position of those consumers in their policy making, I think is a good thing to do. In terms of who it will apply to, I think it was important for us to engage in consultation with a range of bodies that it may apply to try and understand how it might work in practice. So that work is underway just now. It will continue, and I'll be happy to provide further detail to the committee.
Okay, thank you. It's been suggested that it would be difficult for the consumer duty to have a practical impact, given that all other duties public bodies may have to consider. How does the government plan to address this?
Well, I suppose that goes back to the question that the convener asked me, Mr. Lyle, and I am cognizant of the concerns that I think the convener used the term box ticking exercise. Those concerns do exist, and I want to avoid that. And again, that's part of the reason we're having the consultation with public bodies, to ensure that it is meaningful, it is impactful, it is something that they would be able to do. Also, not one that becomes so burdensome that it becomes impractical for them to do. So, again, that's part of the process of consultation that's happening just now. But I do think that the fact that Consumer Scotland will have to publish an annual report late before Parliament, will have to publish the Consumer Welfare Report that I referred to on a 3-yearly basis, and again lay that before Parliament to demonstrate whether or not the consumer duty is making any impact, it will be important as well, because then Parliament itself can look at that, can ask Consumer Scotland questions about it, and potentially could bring in individual organisations to ask them about it as well. How are they practically putting into effect the consumer duty? And if a committee has concerns about whether or not they're doing it, then can ask them questions about it.
It's fine, thank you.
All right, if there are no further questions from committee member Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Convener, just a couple of quick areas. It's already been raised that there's support for the bill from a number of stakeholders, but perhaps a lack of understanding of how the bill may actually, or the new body may come together. So and you yourself mentioned that the bill's just a first step. So I was wondering if you could very briefly outline your vision, not just for the Consumer Scotland, maybe in the next few years, but also down the future, where you think it will play a role, but also how you think it may take on other responsibilities and expand as an organisation.
Well, I don't want to be too speculative in terms of new powers and new functions. I mean, you might expect me to say, and I will say, Mr. Halker-Johnson, that I think we probably could have seen a more comprehensive range of consumer policy devolved to become the legislative responsibility of the Scottish Parliament, the administrative responsibility of the Scottish Government, or by extension to Consumer Scotland as we're setting up just now. That's not the case, but if it was the case in future, then there's a clear possibility Consumer Scotland could take on some of those functions. In terms of where I want us to be in the future, I want this bill to be the catalyst by which we place the consumer, the individual person, or indeed, if we widen the scope of the definition, as I'm open to, consumers at the heart of public policy making. And I think the consumer duty has a significant role to play, and I hope that will lead to significant improvements in terms of the position of the consumer in Scotland. So some of the particular issues that have been mentioned by Mr MacDonald, Mr Whiteman, they posited some specific examples so that they are greatly reduced, so that they may not arise in the future, or if they do arise, that they can be resolved as quickly as possible.
Well, can I ask, and take those points? I mean, you talked about parliamentary scrutiny of the body as it be responsible there. So, if it's to be that catalyst, how do you measure its performances? What targets can you set? How do you judge the success of the new body in achieving its objectives and making that difference to the consumer landscape?
Well, its objective ultimately is, it's not, unless it determines itself, actually, or potentially through dialogue with Parliament, that it should have specific targets, then we're not establishing it in the face of this bill as being a target-driven body. I don't intend it to be that we legislate for it to be such. Clearly, it could determine that that's something it wants to set for itself, that there should be specific targets, and that would be something that would be perfectly possible for it to do. In terms of measuring its success, I think that will be incumbent for Parliament to do. I do think it was important to empower Parliament to have that scrutiny function. I thought it was important that Consumer Scotland was not only seen to be independent of the Scottish Government, but is independent of the Scottish Government and is accountable to Parliament as a whole. It'll be for Parliament to determine, I think. But you know, its primary focus is to really investigate and prosecute areas of consumer harm, consumer detriment, to look at that, then to make suggestions about how that might be remedied. And I suppose in that sense, actually, really, it'll be for those others that might have that responsibility to resolve and to be held to account, as much as it would be for Consumer Scotland.
Okay, thanks.
All right, if there are no further questions from committee members, thank you very much to the Minister and his team for coming in today. I will suspend the meeting and we'll move into private session at that stage. Thank you.